Hey guys, welcome to our podcast, The Milwaukee Monster.
This podcast tells the true crime story of Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, also known as the Milwaukee Monster. These audio tapes describe the disturbing and sinister actions that Jeffrey inflicted upon his 17 victims, which included luring innocent men and boys who were unknowing of his malicious intent at the time.
So, to start things off, you may be asking, who was Jeffrey Dahmer?
Jeffrey Dahmer was a homosexual cannibal of Milwaukee, Ohio. He got 16 life sentences in prison for murdering boys and men.
And that was how many people he killed?
He killed 17, and he admitted to all 17 murders, but in the end he only got prosecuted for 16.
When was his first kill?
His first victim was killed 3 weeks after he graduated in 1978.
Right, and where did he go to school? He went to Revere High School in 1978 and then Ohio State University later in 1978.
Jeffrey started drinking heavily at the age of 14 and was an alcoholic until he went to prison.
Who were his friends and family?
His father was Lionel Dahmer, who taught him how to do taxidermy, which is where they pick up roadkill and they cut through the skin and take out the organs and bones, which later was how he took apart his victims.
And do you think that his killings had anything to do with his childhood or parents?
I do. I think that his father shouldn't have been teaching him how to do taxidermy at such a young age, and his parents weren't around a lot of the time. His mother took a lot of prescription meds and abused her prescriptions, so she wasn't really all there, and his father was always away working. When he was murdering his victims, he said that it made him feel like they could never leave and that he was always close to them.
Right. What do you think might have caused him to kill? Do you think there are multiple reasons or just one set?
I think the reason's unclear. Maybe has something to do with his parents not being around, and when he was a small child he had a surgery and they think that he had too much anesthesia, and after that he was never the same.
So you notice that most of his victims are people of color. Do you think that he was racist?
Personally, I don't think that he was racist. I think that it was a lot with back then that the government and the police force were racist, so he kind of used that to his advantage.
He also talked about how he targeted people that he was attracted to, and that his sexual preferences didn't matter to him. He didn't pick them because he was homophobic or racist, more about his attraction to them and how they stood out to him.
Oh, okay. So let's talk about the new Netflix series Dahmer. Do you think that this is insensitive to families?
I think that it is insensitive to families because it is re-traumatizing and it is putting them through what happened many years ago, and it teaches people how to be a copycat killer, like how not to get caught and what not to do.
I feel it's good to share the story to be able to tell what the victims had to go through, but I feel like they should have not shown it so in depth.
Yeah, I feel like a documentary would be better, and there's plenty of documentaries out about him. There's even another movie that was made about him back in 2017.
Right. And do you think that the show should have been aired?
I do not think it should have been aired. There is no reason that it should have been, especially after all of the documentaries about him, because now people are just sexualizing him and talking about how attractive he was. And from his point of view, which the show was in, it makes him look like he was a victim instead of his victims actually being the victim.
Yeah, I feel like they should have made the film by the point of view of the victims to show kind of what they had to go through, because in some points of the show, it was making you kind of feel bad for Jeffrey and everything he had to go through to get there.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you think that Netflix could just be capitalizing on all of this? True crime is such a big genre right now that Netflix probably saw that story and wanted to make something from it, and they did make millions.
Yeah, exactly. So they didn't really care about the feelings of the victims' families, more of the money they were making.
Yeah, they didn't even reach out to the victims' families. Do you think there are any good things about this show?
I think there is a little good to it because I knew Jeffrey Dahmer was a murderer before the show, but once it came out, I watched it and I was intrigued and wanted to know more. But then again, there is a lot of misinformation in the show that misleads you.
So did you find that after watching the show and then doing research, you found that a lot of the parts weren't shown or just weren't there or were fake?
Yeah, there was a few differences. In the show, they talk about Jeffrey's neighbor in the apartment who would constantly call the police on him, and she was very involved in the story. But when you do research and find out more about him, you find out she wasn't really his neighbor and she was not involved in that much of the story.
Yeah. So I see people online being attracted to Jeffrey Dahmer. What do you guys think about that?
I think it's disturbing.
Yeah, it's pretty messed up to be able to idolize a killer like that.
Yeah, I had saw that his original glasses that he wore in prison actually just sold for $150,000 the other day.
That is terrible.
Yeah, that's so messed up.
While he was in jail, people would also send him cards and money and comics of himself, like glorifying who he was as a person. So I feel like that wasn't really the best way to go. And people dressing up in costumes like him and saying that they wanted to be him for Halloween.
So how did he initially get caught?
He got caught because one of his victims had gotten away and they ran and they notified the police. And the cops didn't quite believe it at first because, like before, we said all of his victims were people of color. So he brought the police to his apartment and they were looking through and they found Polaroid pictures of his victims after they were murdered inside of his dresser drawer. And then they found a jug full of acid that he would use to burn the skin off of the bones.
Yeah, Tracy Edwards. He was the one that went to Dahmer's apartment agreeing to take naked photos for $100. Then once he got there, he realized that things weren't seeming right. So he decided to run away and get out.
Yeah, I heard that another one of his victims was lobotomized but had not been killed yet, so he tried to escape. And Dahmer had assured police that he was just his drunken lover who had run away after a fight.
Who was also a minor. The minor didn't even have any ID on him or any sort of identification, no driver's license or anything, so the police just brought him back to his custody.
Yeah, and Dahmer showed the police pictures of the boy that he had taken earlier as proof, even though it wasn't really proof.
Yeah, and he was visibly intoxicated. And they still decided to bring him back.
He was barely conscious.
And how do you think the families really feel about this show? Like, you know, showing every single detail. Do you think it's, like, would be re-traumatizing them?
I feel like it's very insensitive to the families, especially not to be able to contact them in advance to tell them, like, what they were doing and everything. And especially using the victims' real names and even showing real pictures of them at one point.
Yeah, that seems very inappropriate. So again, it just seems like Netflix has been capitalizing off of this horrific story. So, Jeffrey Dahmer died at the age of 34. How did he die so early?
Jeffrey was beaten to death by a fellow inmate, Christopher. This happened in Columbia Correctional Institution in Wisconsin on November 28th, 1994.
I'm pretty sure that the police set up that because when the inmate, Christopher, came into the room, the police all left and they were no longer guarding as they were cleaning. So I feel like the police might have had something to do with that because they really did not like him in prison.
Yeah, that was true. They even showed that in the television show too.
Yeah.
So that was some true part of it.
In this show, they talked a lot about how Christopher was saying that God told him to go and take care of Jeffrey. Like, what do you guys think about that?
I feel like he was also a crazy person, seeing that he was also in jail for murdering people. I don't think it's his job to bring justice to other people.
So, obviously, it's very big in the media. What do you think his parents think about the whole thing?
Jeffrey's father, Lionel, has spoke a lot about it, and he was just trying to say that it wasn't his fault because he was being blamed a lot for it. And his mother tried to act like she didn't even know him.
In the series, didn't they portray it as the father admitting it was his fault because he also had those intents, like he also had the thoughts of doing that to people?
Yeah, his father did admit that he had some very similar thoughts to Jeffrey.
Did that happen both in real life and the show, or just the show, though?
Lionel actually wrote a story in 1994 called A Father's Story, and it was his point of view on the whole thing that happened.
He made a lot of money from that book, even though I feel like he got a lot of backlash too, seeing as a lot of people put the blame on him.
Yeah, but in the end, he knew that his thoughts were an incorrect way of thinking and he didn't act upon those thoughts, unlike Jeffrey.
Didn't Jeffrey also read the book that his father wrote before he published it?
Yes, he said it made him very emotional and that it was surprising some of the stuff that he read in the book. So, when he was finally convicted, was he sane?
He was convicted sane when he was alive, and to this day he's still convicted sane, but I'm not too sure that he was Like, in my opinion, if you have those thoughts and you act upon those thoughts, are you really sane?
True. And he did have a lot of mental disorders too as well.
He had borderline personality disorder, schizophrenia, and psychotic disorder.
So when do you think the line was crossed with this show?
I think the line was crossed when they started showing him doing sexual behaviors with naked bodies and dead bodies, and showing how he would murder them and what he would do to them, putting them in the acid and keeping them in his fridge. I find that disturbing.
Yeah, I find that disturbing too. And that's all we have to talk about today, guys. What do you think about this case? Do you think this Netflix series was too much?